Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. We're going to give just a few minutes here to still see a few people coming in, and we just want to make sure that we have everyone to see the start of the broadcast. So just about one more minute and we'll get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Hyperscale or Enterprise, which cloud is best for your business? We know you have many choices when it comes to how you spend your day, and we're excited you've chosen to spend it with us for the next 45 minutes. My name is Karen Ianta with Expedient, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. But before we get started, I'd like to go over some general housekeeping items with you. All attendees are in listen mode, and audio is provided by the number or the phone using the numbers provided in your reminder email. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording within 24 hours. If you have any questions, please enter them into the chat panel throughout the webinar, and we'll answer after the presentations. And you'll notice that control panel on the bottom of your screen, and just hover over and click the chat. Our presenters today are John White, Chief Innovation Officer with Expedient, and Carl Brooks, Analyst with 451 Research. Let's move on to our agenda. First, we'll have Carl analyze the cloud adoption trends and discuss the most common challenges organizations face when implementing cloud services. Then we'll move on to which cloud is best for your business, and that will be presented by John White, and he'll compare the differences between hyperscale and enterprise cloud offerings and look at the optimal use cases for each cloud type. Then before we get into the question and answers, John will discuss findings from a recent cloud benchmark report that measured the performances of Expedient Enterprise Cloud against comparable offerings from AWS, Azure, and Rackspace. And then finally, we'll continue with the questions and answers. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce everyone to Carl. Carl, take it away.
Thanks very much. As noted, my name is Carl Brooks. I work for 451 Research. We are an international market research and analysis firm, and we cover emerging technologies, in particular the cloud computing landscape. My particular brief is cloud computing providers, managed services providers, cloud platforms, and technology and supply chain. So with that said, what I'd like to cover today is a basic overview of the market as we see it outlaid today. If we could move on to the next slide, please. If someone could advance the slide, thank you very much. So what we see today are a few dominant trends. One is that the market for on-demand infrastructure as a service, cloud computing, is growing and it's diverse. There are the large public cloud providers, AWS, Azure are the top two right now, but there are hundreds of smaller providers. There are many different shapes and forms that these providers take. They have their own idiosyncrasies. They have their own advantages and disadvantages. These providers have environments that are tailored for different types of problems, different types of solutions for their own customers. And we don't see that as something that is shrinking. We're not moving towards a world where infrastructure is universal and completely homogeneous. It's actually rather becoming more tailored. However, the dominant trend is that it is on demand, it is easy to consume, it is available programmatically and over the network, and it's quite mainstream at this point. It has become to the point that choosing public cloud for infrastructure for new projects or even for migrations or transformations in the IT operations has become a default choice. Everyone's, AWS is the lingua franca of today's IT infrastructure. However, it's not always the best choice. AWS has its own peccadillos. It has its strengths, it has its weaknesses, and it's better suited for some things than others. If you need a distributed global environment that needs to reach as many transactional points as possible, and you don't particularly care about the performance or speed at which the results come back from that, AWS is your Valhalla. It is the place to run a distributed web application, for instance. That's more or less what it was built for. And it is very, very good at that. It's also very good at some of the specialties it's taken on. It has a variety of different services on it, but so does Microsoft Azure in different directions. And so does IBM, which is a fully managed service, but quite on the same scale as AWS and Azure. However, you can't simply sign up and get it with a credit card. So in order to demonstrate exactly how mainstream this is and how large this market has become, we collect a number of revenue estimates from both public and private cloud providers. We currently have around 1,500 vendors and providers that we collect revenue sources from in this space. For the infrastructure hosting revenue, which counts public cloud, hosted private cloud, hosted infrastructure services generally, there's roughly 800 vendors that we collect direct data from, and there's many more out there that we don't count, or we count as inclusively as possible. But it's a large amount of money. For 2019, we think it's going to be $53 billion. Of that, AWS is going to be, pretty good chunk of that. $24 billion out of that is going to be AWS. If you look at the left, you'll see we have a top 10 list of top 10 hosting providers. You'll see the diversity there. AWS, IBM, Microsoft, Google, Rackspace, Salesforce, which offers its own infrastructure services as well as platform as a service. Heroku, Alibaba from China, CenturyLink. These are not all the same service. AWS is one thing, it's its own thing. But there are many, many different and divergent choices here. And so it's important to understand both the scale of this adoption and the range of choices that are out there in terms of infrastructure on demand. And we can roughly break it up into public cloud, do it yourself, pay with a credit card, or pay by arrangement directly with the cloud provider, and managed hosted private cloud, managed cloud services in general. This is where a provider gives not only the basic infrastructure on demand access, but also provides a range of managed services on top of that, not limited to, but including backup, maintenance, monitoring, security, all that sort of thing. Now, in order to highlight exactly how robust this trend is, we have collected data from enterprise buyers. We have a panel of about 60,000 enterprise IT buyers that we survey on a circular basis. Of those who consider themselves to be adopting, new technology adopters, more than half of them are pragmatic. They say that we are pragmatic about new technology, but we'll act sooner rather than later. This is not the cutting edge anymore. Only 13% of the respondents we talk to consider themselves bleeding edge adopters or experimental adopters, or those who want new technology. This is pretty settled. If you want infrastructure today, it's going to be in the form of infrastructure as a service. And more likely than not, you're looking towards external providers to do it, whether it be managed or unmanaged public cloud. And when we talk about digital transformation, which is a sort of inclusive term that we use to refer to essentially updating in your IT shop to be able to leverage and use cloud technologies and cloud services more effectively, there's a solid 69% of all of the respondents consider themselves to be already in that process or on the way. So this is a strong majority of enterprises consider that they are already acting on the need in which to adopt and to transform the way that they perform IT, essentially. And a lot of that is driven by the need to leverage cloud computing models. You can do it faster, you can do it quicker, you can do it more cost effectively, and these are trends that are very hard to buck these days, and enterprises are well aware of this. Next slide, please. Now, when we talk about adoption patterns, we talk about the different ways in which you can adopt. There's quite a range. You know, software as a service is a no-brainer. That's the first choice everyone makes. That's hosted email, that's Salesforce CRM, Taleo, what have you. These are applications and workloads that are settled. They're not going to change. They're not going to. Nobody's doing anything particularly innovative with them at the moment. They are known quantities, and they are things that IT does not want to run and should not run within their own data centers, with some limited exceptions. You know, if you have a highly regulated federal agency, you might want to run your own email server. Anybody else? No. Push that out to somebody else. Let them do the work. Infrastructure as a service, public cloud is next. It's a strong trend. It's where, as I said, the default option to go. But then you also have private cloud, VMware, Azure Stack, OpenStack, Cloud Stack, what have you. There are, we estimate, somewhere in the range of 15 to 20 viable private cloud software, platform software options that you could run if you so choose. And many enterprises do, because they want to optimize what they've got in-house. They have data centers already. They want to amortize or draw down what they've got in there, or they simply do a technology refresh. And if you do that today, you almost can't buy a server or an application stack without getting some form of private cloud enablement in there, some sort of orchestration, virtualization just baked in already. Third-party hosting, data center, managed private cloud. But mostly what the slide shows is that the range of options and the range of choices that enterprises have to make, because every application and every workload is going to have a little bit of a different need, and you have the choice available. You don't have to pick a vendor and stick with it. There's no sort of everybody get in the boat and off we go. That's not the case right now. Enterprises adopt across many different platforms, many different providers. Something like 90% of the enterprises we survey have multiple cloud infrastructure providers, and they have multiple cloud infrastructure installments going at the same time, which leads us to the next topic. One slide forward, please. Hybrid is the basic expectation for most IT enterprise shops, at least leading into it. Not everyone is there. Not everyone is able to fully realize the promise of multi-cloud management or hybrid cloud enablement, where you might use different providers, different environments within the same application stack to achieve better performance or better efficiencies. But most enterprises fully expect that that's where they're going. 62% of everyone that we survey says, yep, it's going to be a multi-cloud world. You know, we have there's a strong coterie of folks that are going all in, 17%, roughly 1 out of 5. They say we're just going to do, everything's going to be public cloud. We're going to go all in. But that's not a majority, far from it. Most enterprises fully expect that they were going to be managing resources on-prem. They're going to be managing resources in public and managed, hosted private clouds, and they're going to do it all together. They don't especially relish the prospect. There are a lot of, snarls and snags. It's not an easy process to do this, but the dominant trend here is that enterprises are moving through a process of transforming how they do IT, how they become, they do their own service delivery to their own constituents, and how they take advantage of these public cloud and private cloud options that are out there. And if we can move forward one slide here. Challenges remain, and all of these challenges, the top challenges that I'm going to talk about are not necessarily technical. The first and always challenges is an evergreen topic. It's been this way since I started with 451 over 7 years ago. We started to take out these surveys. Governance and compliance is the largest challenge that enterprises face, and this is really it's a matter of retooling your paperwork. Basically, it's a matter of retooling how you do things like reporting. It's a matter of changing all of the business processes that revolve around governance, compliance, regulations that apply to whatever workload that you're trying to move or trying to optimize. Security is a big part of that, of course, because you have to retool the way you look at all of the different challenges around security. Not from a technical perspective, you're still, we're not talking about, fixing vulnerabilities or fighting off DDoS attacks or anything like that. We're talking about changing business practices around how security is reported and monitored, where the demarcation lines for responsibility are. This is a big part of the managed services component. Compliance and regulatory burdens are still a very large upsell for managed services providers, and one thing that public clouds cannot do for you. All of them can be made compliant, but it's still a lot of manual work that stands in the way as the largest barrier of adoption. Cloud migration and integration, this is the next one. This is where you see some technical issues pop up, but mostly what they relate to when we ask the questions in the survey data is around compatibility and integration. Is my application going to work properly if I move to a public cloud environment? It's this funky thing I've been having my developers code against for 15 years going to work the same way on my SQL server and on Azure SQL server? You don't know. You have to find out. It becomes a big headache when you look at these technical integrations, and so compatibility becomes a huge draw. We've seen VMware on AWS, we've seen VMware on Azure now, and other places, because within the enterprise you see a large part of IT infrastructure these days is VMware based, and when you see and you look out across the available landscape of cloud infrastructure providers, enterprises want to see things they're familiar with. They want to bring their tools with them. They want to bring, to the extent that they can, the expertise and resources that they have. The third challenge in there is optimizing for cost. It's been axiomatic that cloud is cheaper. We have something that we refer to as the eye-watering AWS surprise bill, where you pilot a project or you cost out a budget for infrastructure on something like AWS or Azure. You suddenly get blindsided by things you didn't expect, such as unexpected transit charges, scaling. So a bill that was budgeted for a couple hundred or a couple $1,000s a month suddenly becomes 10 times that, because enterprises don't understand necessarily the risks or the costs associated with the various ways in which these platforms work. And it's different for everyone. Every different provider that you can go out there, from AWS to Azure to IBM to OVH to Rackspace, pick your poison. They all have different cost models. They all have different cost structures, and again, also performance options. Some clouds perform better in different, in different scenarios than others. AWS's network, for instance, is built to be incredibly robust and failure-proof. However, it is not built for performance from machine to machine. Microsoft Azure, likewise, their storage services are incredibly consistent in terms of performance, but not necessarily the fastest. If you're used to having, blazing fast on-premise server connections, you're not going to see that in the cloud. So you have to be able to tweak and tune your applications and your workloads to, take advantage of what's out there, or to find the provider that has the right mix there, and avoid getting blindsided by things like that. So when we talk about optimizing infrastructure for cost as a problem, that's it. It's when you look out there and you say, how much is this actually going to cost me? It's not just a calculator and a spreadsheet. It's, there's more work involved in that. Refactoring applications, optimizing cloud infrastructure, cloud transformation strategy. All of these things are not technical problems. They're not problems in code or development. These are problems around business process, around IT operations and process, around basic things like managerial tasks. So those are the major roadblocks here. It's not, can I use it? Of course you can. APIs make everything easy. We have containers now. We have virtualization is well understood and nearly uniform. It's how much of a pain in the butt is it going to be for the rest of my organization to get used to making this change. So that's where we have it as the market overall. And the adoption is, it's solid and it is growing. at a rapid opportunity, and is where all of the trends in IT point us to, is more and more adoption of external cloud services, because enterprises have a fundamental conundrum, is that they have to become more efficient in their service delivery. They have to provide more and more capacity, compute, storage, network every single year, and budgets are not going up. The only way to solve this problem is through external efficiencies, which means taking advantage of the fact that cloud providers, managed infrastructure, and hosted private cloud providers can do this much more efficiently than enterprises can. So the key takeaways here is cloud transformation and adoption is pervasive, but it's not uniform. It takes different shapes. Every organization has its unique challenges. And providers have popped up to serve those needs. We have, as I said, hundreds of, cloud providers at scale in the world today, thousands if you want to look on a smaller scale, dominated by the large public clouds. It's true, but they provide an example. They don't necessarily provide the only option. Workloads spread across various cloud venues based on need and suitability. It's just as easy to consume more than one provider as it is to stick with one, and enterprises do that. Sometimes it's willy-nilly, I've got to solve a problem on Friday afternoon, I'm going to pick this provider. Sometimes it's more of a planned action. We're going to move X amount of this workload by, quarter of this year, and it's going to happen in these kinds of steps. But it is not, as I said, uniform. Enterprises face challenges around compatibility and resource acquisition, skills, talent, simply the ability to perform the extra work. These are major challenges, as well as transforming or changing how they actually do an application. Sometimes it's better to refactor. Sometimes you want to throw the entire thing out with the bathwater. Sometimes you can't. So you have a mainframe system that's been lying in your basement for 30 years. You can't get rid of it, and you can't do without it. And yet, how do you square that in the face of AWS or Azure? Well, there are ways. The majority of spend and adoption for enterprises in the market is through managed infrastructure and hosted private cloud. It's going to be, it's going to be a fact that managed services providers are going to perform the majority of the labor, on and across both hosted private cloud and public cloud at this point, because enterprises simply don't have the skills, the talent or the resources to take advantage of it. That is their singular appeal here, is that they provide the IT work that your enterprise IT shop can't. And managed services providers can fill enterprise demands more effectively than doing it yourself. You've got, I talked about compliance and regulatory burdens earlier. If you are a managed services provider, this is an area of expertise where you can perform effectively at scale, compliance and reporting that an enterprise would have to do by itself individually. Managed services provider can do it for 10 customers instead of just one, which would be the enterprise itself. That's one example. Other things like network monitoring or security, security operations, again, function better at scale with a provider or third party than they do at an individual enterprise's, unique IT organization. So that's it in a nutshell. We're all going this direction, and we've got to find ways to deal with it, but there are choices, and choices abound. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to John White from Expedient to talk to you a little bit more about this.
Hey, thanks, Carl. Appreciate your insights as always. So this is John White. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer here at Expedient. And part of my days are spent actually working and talking with guys like Carl. So I spend a lot of time with analysts, understanding where they see the future going, giving them feedback on where I see the future going. And I give them a lot of that feedback based upon my interactions with customers all over the world and kind of understanding their business and IT challenges. Another way I get a lot of good information is actually sitting on advisory boards from a lot of different partners. So Cohesity, Zerto, Dell EMC, a lot of those companies then I get to interact with different businesses, as well as then get their insights to kind of start to understand and kind of build and shape a product strategy for Expedient so that we can deliver value-added services for our current clients as well as then prospects in the future. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of which cloud is best for your business. And, Carl talked a lot about the hyperscalers And we all know a lot about the hyperscalers. They're in your face with advertising, marketing. You see them in Forbes everywhere you go. So I'm not going to really talk about that, but I'm going to highlight some of the differences. And I've actually been doing this for quite some time. I actually wrote a presentation back in 2013 that you can find on the Expedient YouTube channel, The Tale of Two Clouds, really breaking down the concepts, differences between an enterprise cloud where the hardware is redundant and an application cloud where the application is redundant. And the hyperscalers today are more focused on the application cloud, where we've been focusing a lot on creating an interesting marketplace to kind of handle the enterprise and deal with some of the legacy applications, and then move that forward into the next version of cloud that we think is kind of the best fit for you. And so today I'll talk about some of the differences. I'll talk about some of the different costs and the performance that you get, as all clouds are not created equal, just like everything else. There's not a one-size-fits-all for IT, just like there's not a one-size-fits-all for pants or any other tangible item you might buy out there. So quickly, a little bit about Expedient. We were founded in 2001. We're owned by Landmark Media Enterprises. We have zero institutional debts, and we go and buy a data center or a cloud position. We actually do that all in cash, so we're not leveraged by any debts that would make us make different decisions than we would. That's really the best for our clients. We focus on three main areas of our business, so cloud, co-location, and we're also a managed service provider. We actually were donned out of the network world, so we have a heavy network background as well. We operate cloud locations on the East Coast and the West Coast of the United States, as well as in Australia, Germany, and Canada. Some of those in our own data centers, some of them in partner data centers. And something unique about Expedient is we actually will run our cloud architecture inside of our customers' data centers as well. So an on-premises solution is available to meet maybe security or regulation needs, or you still have an asset in a data center that you're not really ready to fully depreciate yet. We have a wide variety of infrastructure, so it's not only just cloud services, and that's a big difference between us versus the hyperscale providers. We are providing infrastructure as a service, as well. We're wrapping in all the other managed services that you need to make IT work, as well as you need to maybe make some of those legacy systems continue to operate. Carl mentioned the mainframe. That's still very relevant and prevalent in a lot of specifically financial institutions, and we have the co-location space to go and handle that. Focus a lot on security, compliance, data protection, managed services like patching and handling firewalls, things like that that kind of make IT tick. Now, one thing that's often surprising when we start talking to different companies and analysts all over the world is the kind of the scale of Expedient. So we all know the large hyperscale cloud providers. You can see those. Expedient is actually one of the larger VMware cloud providers as well, up there with IBM and Rackspace. And we have a lot of recognitions in the industry that are really been great accolades over the last few years. Being a top workplace is obviously important. We have a great employee retention. I've actually been with the company myself 15 years. We've also been featured in the Gartner Magic Quadrant the last 3 years. In 2019, we were one of 11 companies. We were just recently in 2018 noted as the Cloud Partner of the Year for the Americas from VMware, which is a huge recognition, as there's a lot of other big cloud providers out there. Some I have on this list here today. We were able to beat them out for a lot of our innovation that we built with enterprise cloud that I'll mention a few times here. We're also on the Channel Futures MSP 501. So this is a worldwide ranking. We're number 12 for the managed service providers that's out there. And then we also have a VMware Cloud Verified verification, which we're one of a handful of companies there. So we're using VMware's software instead of a certified solution to then provide cloud architecture out for our customers. So let's talk a little bit about the differences, and I'm not going to really go deep dive into this because I think most people understand it right now. The difference between smart hardware versus smart applications. So it's all about where the redundancy lies. In the enterprise cloud environment from Expedient, it's very similar to the virtualization platforms that you've been running on your premises for a long time now. The hardware actually, when it fails, the virtual machines actually move to a new set of hardware, and you have redundancy throughout from the network standpoint, from the SAN standpoint. Everything is enterprise grade hardware underneath. So when you need to have kind of high availability of a virtual machine, you only pay for one virtual instance instead of paying for two virtual instances create high availability, which is really the model on the right, which is the model of the hyperscale cloud. So you need to have at least 2 virtual machines to make sure that you're hitting the SLA that you need to provide to your end customer, and then provide that full redundancy there. One of the best ways to kind of know and understand which cloud is best for you is to kind of look at it. And we created a spreadsheet here, and all these slides will be shared, so you can grab this and take a look at it. But we created this spreadsheet to kind of start to answer and ask some questions about what you're actually going to be putting inside of this environment. A lot of new development, like Carl mentioned, is being focused on the application cloud today. That is the best way to go and grab redundancy and scale for the future. But if you have an existing or off-the-shelf application that you're buying from maybe a third party, or something you built, over the last 10 years, 15, 20 years, whatever it is, that's going to be more suitable on an enterprise cloud. The whole concept of cloud native, again, application cloud's better suited there. And then it ties all into, where is the redundancy derived? Is it in the application or is it in the hardware? One thing that people often overlook on the cost element is how long is something going to be powered on. If you're under 50% of the time, it's probably best suited for a hyperscale cloud. If it's going to be more of 100% always on every month, that VM is going to be up and running. That's something that's going to be more suitable for an enterprise cloud, as the cost models are more aligned to the way you've bought virtualization in the past. It's more of a steady state runtime environment. So it's not going to be that burstable or scalable, flexible environment that you've kind of hoped and dreamed of. It's going to be something, okay, I need to have this VM running all the time, or I need to have the storage there and available all the time, because it's really critical data that we need to have available to our customers or our other systems to make decisions. The other big thing is, and this will also impact costs as well as then your performance to the customer, is the SLA. The application clouds and hyperscale cloud providers are typically going to be around 99.95%, somewhere around there, where an enterprise cloud offering from Expedient is going to be 100% SLA. So it's going to be a lot different as far as what you can expect for an average amount of downtime. And you can kind of walk through the rest of these, and I won't touch on all of them today, but there's other different decisions you can or questions you can ask yourself or your developers to kind of figure out which cloud is going to be really the best suited for you. And we have a lot of different clients that we interact with, and I talk to different companies all over the world and kind of gauge on where they're at in kind of this journey to cloud. In the beginning, everybody thought it was going to be great. I'm just going to swipe my credit card with one of the hyperscalers, and that's going to be my cloud provider, and everything else we'll just kind of figure out along the way. And that a lot of those people that did that, they actually are the ones that are usually featured in the Wall Street Journal or Forbes, because they've had, maybe challenges with expense or employees or whatever it might be. So we view this on this kind of bridge as far as, where people would like to go and where people are today. Most companies today, they are using VMware Hypervisor. They have a ton of existing applications. Most people aren't just brand new, like the Ubers of the world or Pinterest. So they've been operating infrastructure for quite some time. A lot of their employees, they have, what's being termed now legacy IT skills. And those skills are more focused on, server client applications, as well as then running hypervisors like VMware. And they're traditionally doing that inside of a box where they have more of a fixed capacity. Now, if you look at the other end of the bridge, the other end of the spectrum, they have where their CIOs, their CTOs, CEOs even, are wanting to go. They want it to be all containers because they heard that's going to be the cheap, scalable way to do it. They want to be able to use multiple clouds because they don't want to be painted into a corner, similar to how people hard-coded IPs back in the day. They want this big unified management plane. They want integrated security. They want to be able to span your application to kind of live across everything and be protected and ready to go. And that's a great dream for most, but it's really, something that looks like a very daunting task to really kind of make that jump across the bridge. And Expedient's purview, after, talking to companies, talking to analysts, talking to our vendor partners, was to really create something that was more of a near-term solution for them, and providing them a single interface to look at multiple resources across Expedient's environment via vCloud Director, to handle existing applications as well as then applications for the future. So it's a great place to create virtual machines as well as containers. And we wanted to actually use those existing IT skills. So a cloud architect of a hyperscale architect is a very different world than being a VMware architect. We wanted to take the VMware knowledge, cloudify some of those pieces to understand what it can look like now, and then start to then figure out their vision and path for the future. And a lot of that was to start to really reduce the risk of migration. A lot of companies are in kind of this kind of holdout model where they're saying, okay, we need to see the cloud develop a little bit more. Maybe it's going to get cheaper. Maybe they'll talk about better security. We need to kind of figure out, how we can kind of handle that migration and reduce the risk of upsetting our employees, upsetting our customers, as well as in creating downtime where we might have not had it before. A lot of people then are focused on, starting to work and interact with APIs. We can provide that inside of a near-term solution, and then really provide, elastic capacity. So it's taking a lot of today's and kind of modernizing that for the future. And we've done a ton of different talks and presentations on this. I'm actually going to be at VMworld this year talking about it. We'll have a booth there as well doing demos of this. So if you're around, definitely stop by. But it's a way to kind of take a lot of your existing IT knowledge today and kind of move it forward and a little bit more of a lily pad kind of steps across that bridge instead of a one big jump to the other side of the ocean or the other side of the creek that you might be on. And we're doing a lot of that via this Expedient Enterprise Cloud. And we'll kind of talk a little bit right now about kind of the hardware layer of it and some of the software we're using. But you'll probably look at this build here and say, okay, that's probably similar to something that I might have inside of my four walls, but maybe just a little bit bigger. We are using all of VMware's cloud products. So vCloud Director is the front end on it. We have NSX for all the network virtualization. We have vSAN underneath to provide a very high performance SAN, very similar to what you're running today, to make sure that those workloads run exactly the same that you would expect them to run on this newer architecture. And then we're using a lot of their other software to then make sure all the operations are going smoothly. Things like vRealize operations and vRealize log insight give us information about what's kind of going on in the system from a metrics standpoint, and then what could be happening through like a correlation engine inside of log insight. Very similar hardware that you probably have. We're using a hyperconverged box here from Dell. Those nodes then are built into 64 node clusters, and whenever we fill up one of those pods, we go and we launch another 64 nodes and get that up and running. Everything is encrypted. All of the access into it is utilizing the existing Active Directory that you might have, or LDAP, and then two-factor authentication to log into this cloud. So again, very similar to what you're using today. Now, one of the problems that companies will have is they'll go to the cloud and they'll reach two different problems, whether it's the performance of it. We all know the term noisy neighbor, or maybe it's cost, and they didn't get that the bill. They didn't understand the bill that they got because it's not what they budgeted. And we actually go and we actually use a third party to go and do analysis on our cloud platform, both in performance as well as in cost. So in performance, we use a company called Cloud Spectator, and this is one of the graphs, and you can actually download this full paper on our website, and I know that the team's going to be sending this out in the follow-up email. But this graph here shows, okay, what's the performance of the CPU and RAM that Expedient, AWS, Azure, and Rackspace can provide, and what is that when you actually divide it by the monthly price? So you can see the Expedient value here for CPU is really high, higher than all the other hyperscale providers here, as well as Rackspace, and significantly higher than Rackspace. But so you can make sure that you're getting the performance upgrade that you need instead of just something that you're not sure what it's going to look like in the future. We do that also with storage. So again, storage is very important. We want to make sure that we're providing more performance than the other cloud providers, as well as then more than you might have today in your existing environment. Another thing to really look at is how do the costs compare from other cloud providers. So for the most part, Expedient Enterprise Cloud is actually less cost than the hyperscale providers, AWS and Azure. And a lot of that goes with the way we design for enterprise applications, where those applications are really designing for more of a distributed application. So we can handle both, but our focus really is the enterprise application of today. And another big element that goes into the costing elements, and this is something we actually provide data back to 451 on, as they do a lot of great analysis on public cloud and private cloud costing, is kind of how you actually buy and paying for what you consume with Expedient. And the best analogy we could think of is if you were buying chips for, let's say a birthday party. You wouldn't want to buy everybody their own individual bag. You're going to have waste, you're going to have leftover, and it's really expensive to do that because you have all that extra packaging. You're going to want to buy family size. Buying resources inside of Expedient is really buying the family size package. You're only paying for what you consume. You're not paying into t-shirt sizes where you have over provisioned or underutilized resources. You're actually just paying for what you need inside of Expedient, and that's one element that we can do to provide a predictable cost element to you, as well as then greater savings, because you're only really consuming what you actually consume. So we have a lot of different takeaways, and I want to make sure we have time for question and answer. The enterprise cloud, in our opinion, and our customers' opinion, is one of our fastest growing products we've ever had. Leveraging the VMware skills to be able to cloudify your virtual environment is really the desired state when people say, we need to go to the cloud. Inside of this environment, you have all the same things that you need from the application cloud providers, APIs. You can do infrastructure as a code, automation. Everything is consumption-based pricing. You can go to just purchase the resources you need instead of t-shirt sizes. That's going to provide you a predictable model down the way. But one of the big elements here is that there's no real need to refactor apps to make the move. You can move into the enterprise cloud today by pretty much dragging and dropping those virtual instances, those VMDKs, into our environment, and they're going to perform and they're going to cost typically better than what you have today. And as you go along, you can start to refactor applications with the hyperscale providers, with Expedient, because we provide high-speed network connectivity into AWS, Azure, and Google, as well as then we provide Kubernetes services inside of the same place that your virtual machines are running. So you can start to then provide a development platform for your developers for future growth. And you can really start with the virtual machines, move the cloud containers in the future, all inside of the same platform, which provides, really kind of an awesome one-stop shop to kind of provide that infrastructure to, ease some of those compliance burdens that Carl mentioned, as that's probably one of the bigger factors that we see when people are looking to go to the cloud. How do you deal with compliance? How do you deal with security? This platform makes that really, really easy. So with that, I'll definitely open it up to questions, and I know we have a few already in the chat. Please definitely start filling those out, and we'll hit them up over the next 15 minutes.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Carl. That was a great discussion on cloud computing. A lot of information shared indeed. As John mentioned, after the webinar, all attendees will receive links to download the slides from today's webinar, and a full version of the Cloud Spectator report that John discussed will also be included. We are now moving into the question and answer portion of today's webinar. If you haven't already, please enter your questions into the chat panel. And as you prepare your questions, I'd also like to mention that a short survey will be conducted at the end. It'll pop up at the end of this the webinar, and we would appreciate that you take a few seconds just to answer those survey questions. They'll better help us to improve our future webinars. And as a final reminder, a link to the recording of today's webinar will be emailed to you within 24 hours. So with that said, I see a lot of questions coming in, and
you want me to start?
Yeah, go ahead, John.
Sure. So one of the questions we have coming in is, I want to know how the Expedient solution provides connectivity back into my legacy data center environment. I expect some apps in the Expedient solution will need connectivity to some legacy services. Yes, that's something that we see on a regular basis. So we talk about, hybrid cloud maybe a little bit differently than the rest of the market is. We do have a network background. So if a company has their own data center, we can actually provide network connectivity back into that environment, and we can actually provide it via layer 2, so we can actually tie that their data center into our data center via a layer 2 connection that we can then talk into the Expedient Enterprise Cloud. So if you wanted to keep stuff at your data center, great. We can create one big network to kind of have servers at your data center, our cloud, wherever you might want to need to operate.
Let's see this. Okay, great. Thanks, John. I have another question. It sounds like this one might be for Carl. Carl, are there any specific industry verticals that are more focused on hybrid cloud approaches to IT?
Yes and no. Generally, we see that the sentiment and the planning and the budget is spread pretty equally around all the verticals. Every industry vertical partakes in this at this point. And I think that we see more adoption in areas that are industry that we consider to be tech dependent, but not technically proficient, if you will. So financial, healthcare, for instance, highly dependent on IT. Oftentimes very large environments, and yet they don't produce their own servers or their own software. And so they've actually been doing this a bit longer than other industry verticals. Another area would be, I think, media and communications, where they've been quicker to adopt and move into things like live streaming or business to customer type applications. And they have more of an investment in hybrid simply because they've been doing it longer. But every industry vertical that we see, has essentially got the same outlook on this. It's a pretty universal trend.
Great, thank you. Well, folks, I see that we are at the end of our hour, but I think let's try to continue for a few. We have so many questions. I want to get as many as we can in. So if you'll bear with us, we'll try to continue for another 5 minutes. The next question we have is, how does the customer get notified when they are nearing maxing out their pool? And John, I think that might go to you.
Yep. Yeah, so all of the enterprise cloud, like I mentioned, has vRealize operations on it. That is going to provide you an understanding of a few things that are really important there. So it'll provide you an understanding of how much you're going to use your pool and where you're at in that level. So we're going to send you notifications saying, okay, you've subscribed to 100 gig of RAM. You're at 80% right now. You're at 90%. Do you want to buy more? And we're actually going to work with you on that to actually say, okay, do you need to buy more or not? And one of the ways we work with you on that is we actually provide you an understanding and a report inside of vRealize operations to see if anything needs tuned. Did you create a VM that has 32 gig of RAM and it's only really using 10? A lot of times we're able to tune the virtual machines to then make sure that those billing gotchas really don't sneak up on you, because we're right sizing the VM as we go along and making sure that everything stays pretty tuned.
Great, thanks, John. I think this next one is for you as well. To what do you attribute the favorable Expedient Cloud Spectator metrics versus the hyperscale providers?
One of the biggest things that's different between Expedient and Hyperscale is there's zero oversubscription inside of Expedient. So one of the parts of the Cloud Spectator report, when you look at it, is a metric of coefficient of variation. So the tests are actually run across a week-long period multiple times during the day. And you can actually see how hyperscalers are actually going, and they do have noisy neighbor in there because there's oversubscription. So that's one element. Another element that we saw is that when you're providing performance of multiple cores, when you say you have a performance metric inside of Expedient of 1,000 on a single CPU, when you buy 2 cores, you get 2,000 as your metric. That does not scale linearly inside of the hyperscale providers. That could be the way they set up their hardware. Maybe it's oversubscription, or maybe it's actually the way the hypervisor responds, as all of those are going to be different than VMware. So we talk about some of that in the paper. So definitely take a look at it, and you can kind of see some of the call outs and where we think, what we think, some of these reports, or how the report actually shaped up and why we think it happened that way.
Okay, great. Thanks, John. Let's do one final question, and apologize to not getting to all of your questions, but you'll see Carl and John's contact information on your screen there. So please feel free to follow up with each of them individually with your questions, and we will definitely follow up with all of unanswered questions today. So John, one final question. Does Expedient provide transparent pricing for its services like the hyperscale providers such as AWS or Azure?
Yeah, we do. We've taken the model since inception to actually provide line item pricing out for every one of our services. So there's really no hidden fees, no gotchas. You know exactly what your cost per gig of RAM is, your cost per managed server, your cost per backup, your cost for bandwidth, everything. And we take a lot of different approaches than hyperscalers actually, where the hyperscalers are going to hit you on bandwidth for ins and outs. We're going to give you a 95th percentile sustained bandwidth to kind of allow you to transfer resources any way you want and not get penalized for if you want to make a big move. We've also created 100 gig rings between all of our data centers to then provide very low cost inter data center bandwidth for things like replication or multi-site backups. So yeah, we have a ton of transparency into the pricing.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone, for staying that extra 5 minutes that we went over today. And again, thank you to Carl Brooks and John White for a great webinar this afternoon. Stay tuned for follow-up information and details. And thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.